morning. This hearing will come to order. American consumers today are rightly worried about inflation and rising prices for the goods they buy. Today we're going to talk about a hidden fee that fuels the fires of inflation across America every day. What they may not know is that this swipe fee is contributing to the problem of inflation. When swipe fees on credit and debit cards go up, as they just recently did, it increases inflation, and consumers ultimately pay the price. Ironically, this journey for me started in this very room 16 years ago. Arlen Specter was the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He called a hearing on swipe fees and interchange fees. I attended because I was not familiar with those terms. And I heard for the first time what a swipe fee was, and the fact that when I used my debit card and credit card, a swipe fee was being charged to the retailer that I was ultimately paying. And then I learned that there was virtually no negotiation in those fees. Retailers were at the mercy of the credit cards and banks in terms of what those fees would be. There was no competition because we have a duopoly here, well represented at this table, and that created a situation where the market forces really don't work. They're not supposed to work. They're not designed to work. And what's happened in America, we all know. The statistics on the amount of Americans paying with plastic tell the story. These are from 2020. I'm sure after the pandemic and our change in lifestyle, they're even greater. The number of 2020 transactions involving debit cards, 86 billion. The amount involving credit cards, 41 billion. Between the two, credit and debit cards, in 2020, 127 billion transactions in America. Well, how are we doing with cash transactions? 32.8 billion. How about the use of a check? 5 billion. So we're becoming a nation that clearly, maybe even a world, that pays with plastic. And today we're going to ask a few questions about how those payments are made and the charges that are imposed. This committee held a hearing with witnesses from Visa and Mastercard 16 years ago to discuss anti-competitive fees. We're back. Here's what I've learned. Visa and Mastercard control about 80% of the credit and debit card market. They've established a system of fees and rules that apply to every transaction of the billions I just mentioned involving cards used by thousands of banks. Each time a credit or debit card is used, Visa and Mastercard charge fees that take a cut out of the transaction. You don't see it on the check at the restaurant. It's there. Some of that cut they keep for themselves. Most of it's given to the bank that issued the card. The fee that Visa and Mastercard require the merchant to pay to the card issuing bank is called an interchange fee. It's usually charged as a percentage of the transaction plus a flat fee. For example, 2% plus 10 cents per transaction. That means when a card transaction of $100 is made, the merchant gets less than $98 after the fees are deducted. And merchants end up raising the prices of their products to make up for the deducted fees. You might ask, how much have Americans been charged in interchange fees by Visa and Mastercard since that hearing 16 years ago in 2006? According to payments consultant CMSPI, it's $794 billion, all built into the prices retailers have to charge and consumers have to pay. Interchange fees are designed to avoid competitive market pressures. Banks get the fees, but banks do not set the fees. Instead, the banks let Visa and Mastercard set the fees on their behalf. So the same schedule of fee rates applies for all banks in the network. This means that all banks in the network are guaranteed the same interchange fee, regardless of how efficient or inefficient the bank is in running a card operation or preventing fraud. It's a gravy train. When Visa and Mastercard raise interchange fees, banks want to issue more cards because they make more on each swipe. And Visa and Mastercard profit when there are more swipes because they take their own cut, called a network fee, from the merchant on each swipe. But merchants and their customers take it on the chin, and we're going to hear that firsthand today. What can merchants do to try to keep the fee rates down? Not much. Visa and Mastercard are the negotiating agents for thousands of banks, If a merchant wants to be able to accept payment from those banks' customers, they have to agree to Visa and Mastercard's fees and terms. I remember at that hearing 16 years ago, at that table, one of the customers, or one of the retailers, had a stack about 3 inches tall. They had asked for a copy of the contractual agreement with Visa and Mastercard when it came to imposing fees. They quickly said, this isn't the complete contract. They would only give us part of it, 3 or 4 inches tall. And you expect a grocery store, a restaurant, to go through all this? Bottom line, when fees go up, it costs more to use money. And that cost gets billed into prices consumers pay. Visa and Mastercard raised their swipe fees 2 weeks ago, despite bipartisan opposition from Congress. It was obvious. We're suffering from inflation. Don't raise these hidden fees again. They did it anyway. Senator Marshall and I, Representatives Welsh and Van Dyne, urged them not to do it. They didn't listen, and we'll talk about it today. The credit and debit card systems are not competitive marketplaces. When you don't have real competition, what happens? You get higher costs, less innovation, weaker security. And new potential competitors get stifled. It's a sweetheart deal for the dominant networks, for the biggest banks, and for certain cardholders who have ritzy rewards programs. But the average small business and the consumer, they pay the price. Other countries have figured this out, incidentally. You can't have a fair system when you let networks fix the swipe fees without competition or regulation. So the European Union, Australia, China, India, Israel, South Korea, and more have stepped up to create reasonable swipe fee limits. We have the Durbin Amendment that applies only to debit cards. In 2010, I wrote that law that placed reasonable limits on debit interchange fees that Visa and Mastercard fixed on behalf of big banks. It has generated a lot of talk over the last few years and a lot of TV commercials. And boy, the big banks hate the Durbin Amendment like the devil hates holy water. In the absence of competitive marketplace, there needs to be some limit on Visa and Mastercard's fee fixing. Here's a few steps I'd like to suggest. Let's have transparency and make it clear to consumers in their monthly statements how much of their card purchases are being deducted as interchange fees. You know you have the information, and you know you can provide it. Maybe if consumers knew how much of their cards were costing their favorite restaurants and retailers, they'd use less costly cards. Second, let's stop the practice of charging swipe fees on the part of the transaction amount that is sales tax. That's a swipe tax on top of a sales tax. Give the consumers a break. Let's stop the exclusivity deals where Visa and Mastercard tell banks they can't use any other network on their cards. Let's give merchants a choice of card network options on each swipe and each online sale. Let's make sure that someone besides the dominant network plays a role in setting security standards for cards. Security innovators and startups are being shut out of the current system. And let's reduce inflationary pressure by preventing network fixed swipe fees from being jacked up to unreasonable levels. We got a lot to talk about today. We're joined by a distinguished panel. I thank them for joining this spirited discussion. And let me turn to Senator Grassley.
Yeah. First of all, Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you for working with us on this side of the aisle to make sure that the interests of all stakeholders are taken into consideration. And I particularly want to thank you for including financial institutions in the panel. Interstate and swipe fees is the amount of money that merchants pay for accepting a debit or credit card. These fees vary depending on many factors, but in general end up being between 1% to 3% of purchases. And I just learned, including sales tax, a great focus has been paid to these fees as more and more consumers use credit and debit cards to make their purchases. As many of my colleagues know, this is an issue that has passionate voices on both sides. Many Iowa businesses have complained that it seems that these fees are high for accepting credit and debit cards for purchases. These businesses want to give their customers the option to pay using different methods, but that can be difficult if fees are eating into already tight margins, especially for small business owners. They may have to then pass along these costs to the consumer. On the other hand, there are a number of benefits to card usage for both consumers and businesses, including convenience, security, and increased purchasing power. Consumers may spend more money on cards than if they use cash. Consumers may also benefit through rewards or cash back on their cards. There's a balancing act here that we need to acknowledge, and that any future action should be carefully considered for possible impact. I look forward to hearing from all of you on this subject. As this is a Judiciary Committee hearing, we're looking at competition and whether interchange fees are set above rates that would be found in the competitive market. Two witnesses here today represent Visa, Mastercard, the two largest payment networks in the United States with over 80% share of credit card market. I look forward from hearing whether these rates reflect market forces. I think, though, that when a subject like this comes up, particularly at the time of high inflation, that's a factor that brings attention to a lot of expenditures that people might feel are unnecessary. It seems like every industry, including merchants and banks, have been blamed by the president for inflation. That blame game doesn't work, as President Biden spends trillions of dollars of money as fast as could be spent on a liberal wish list, even when economists were warning about inflation. Earlier this month, Bureau of Labor Statistics reported the 12-month increase of inflation for March was 8.5% year over year. This is the largest increase in over 40 years. All of this obscures the actual rising costs that Iowans have been hit with. In the Midwest, the price of ground beef, 24.5% up, bacon, 26% up, pork chops, 23%, chicken, 31%, eggs, 22%. These are not luxury items, but absolute necessities for families' dinner table. These staggering increases are negatively impacting all Americans and must get under control, and that's not by spending trillions more that are being proposed. I yield.
Thanks, Senator Grasso. We have six witnesses. Thank them for joining us. I'm going to give a short introduction to each before they're recognized. First witness is Laura Shapira-Carrette. She's chair and CEO of Giant Eagle, a supermarket chain headquartered in Pittsburgh, 470 locations throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Maryland, and Indiana. She served as CEO of Giant Eagle since 2012, previously served as the Senior Executive Vice President, Chief Strategy Officer, and Senior Vice President of Marketing. She's worked for Giant Eagle since the year 2000, has a bachelor's degree from Amherst. Glad to have you here. Second witness, Bill Sheedy, Senior Advisor to Visa's Chair and CEO, a position he's held since 2020. He's responsible for strategic initiatives. Previously served as Visa's President of Europe, North America, and Latin America, and he helped lead the company's restructuring in 2007 and its IPO in 2008. Undergraduate degree from West Virginia University and an MBA from Notre Dame. Thank you for being here. Next witness is Linda Kirkpatrick, President of North American for Mastercard. She's responsible for overseeing Mastercard's operations and customer-facing activities in the U.S. and Canada. She's been with Mastercard since 1997, and she previously served in a leadership role involving investor relations, U.S. strategy and communication, U.S. issuers, global rules and standards, compliance programs, and dispute resolution management. She has a degree from Manhattanville College. Thank you for joining us. Next witness is Ed Mirzwinski. Close, Ed? Did I get it right? That's because I represent Chicago. He's the Senior Director of the Federal Consumer Program at the U.S. Public Interest Research Group, known as PIRG. Mr. Mirzwinski has worked for U.S. PIRG since 1989, oversees the Federal Consumer Program, helps to lead national efforts to improve consumer credit reporting laws, identity theft protection, product safety regulation, and more. Co-founder of the Americans for Financial Reform, received his undergraduate degree and master's degrees from the University of Connecticut. Senator Blumenthal, take notice. Our next witness is Charles Kim, Executive Vice President, Chief Financial Officer of Commerce Bankshares, responsible for all financial functions of the company, as well as for the company's strategic planning, marketing, technology, enterprise operations, and consumer card business. He's been with Commerce Bank. He received his undergraduate and MBA degrees from Washington University in St. Louis, the Hilltop. Final witness is Doug Cantor. Since 2021, Mr. Cantor has served as General Counsel for the National Association of Convenience Stores. Previously practiced law at Steptoe & Johnson, where he was General Counsel to the Merchant Payments Coalition, among other organizations. In his career, he worked as Deputy Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and as a public school teacher. Received his BA from the University of Virginia, his JD from Yale Law School. Again, thanks to all of the witnesses for being here. Now, it is customary in this committee for us to ask you to take an oath to tell the truth. So if you'd all please stand and raise your right hand. Do you affirm the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that all the witnesses answered in the affirmative, which now gives them permission to proceed. And we're going to start with Ms. Corrett.
Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. I'm Laura Corrett, CEO, President, and Executive Chair of Giant Eagle, one of the nation's largest multi-format food, fuel, and convenience retailers, with approximately 34,000 team members, operating more than 470 corporate and independently owned and operated store locations throughout 5 Midwest states, including Pennsylvania and Ohio. On April 22nd of this year, with no negotiation or threat of competition constraining them, Visa and Mastercard imposed a fee increase that will cost Giant Eagle $1.3 million annually. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about the impact of swipe fees on our business. I'm also proud to serve as Vice Chair of FMI, the Food Industry Association. FMI works with and on behalf of the entire food industry to advance a safer, healthier, and more efficient consumer food supply chain. FMI's membership includes nearly 1,000 supermarket member companies that collectively operate almost 33,000 food retail outlets and employ approximately 6 million workers. Our industry historically operates on razor-thin margins of 1% to 2%. We operate in a highly competitive market, and as inflation has driven prices higher, our customers have become even more conscious of how they are spending their money, driving down profits. There are 3 points I'd like to make today. First, Giant Eagle's swipe fees have materially increased over time, and the April 22nd unilateral increase will only exacerbate this problem. Visa and Mastercard together control 85% of the market. On April 22nd of this year, both Visa and Mastercard increased the fees retailers pay, and they also created new categories of fees. Every bank that issues credit and debit cards adopted these fee increases without deviation or exception. In my estimation, this cannot possibly comply with either the letter or the spirit of our nation's antitrust laws. This latest price increase fits the pattern we've seen for years. Giant Eagle's been paying higher and higher payment fee costs. Electronic tender sales make up about 82% of our sales transactions for our company. Of the 82% that are electronic tender, about 37% of the total sales are Visa and Mastercard. But when you look at the total card processing fees, Visa and Mastercard make up over 62% of those fees. Over the past 4 years, our Visa and Mastercard fees have grown from 57% of our total fees to 62% of our total fees, while at the same time, Visa and Mastercard sales as a percentage of total sales have declined by almost 2%. In stark contrast, during the pandemic, my company and others like it We're authorized by the USDA to accept online payments from our customers using the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance, SNAP, EBT cards. It's interesting to note that those SNAP electronic transactions are completed securely, without Visa or Mastercard, and without incurring any swipe fees. It's hard for us to understand why SNAP EBT cards could accommodate the changes necessitated by the pandemic, but Visa and Mastercard used it as an avenue to raise prices. Second, millions of customers suffer when swipe fees increase. Because of the unilateral fee increases, Visa and Mastercard that they announced on April 22nd, my company and my customers will be paying an additional $1.3 million in swipe fees. This fee increase came on the heels of Visa reporting in its March 22nd, 2022 quarterly financials that its profit margin was just above 50%. Third, there must be competition in the debit and credit card markets. Visa and Mastercards are the only vendors that Giant Eagle cannot negotiate with. When Giant Eagle buys ketchup or paper towels, its suppliers compete to give Giant Eagle the best price. Ultimately, our customers benefit from a competitive market. In contrast, Visa and Mastercard do not compete for merchant business. The fees associated with accepting any type of payment for a particular good should be incidental to the transaction and certainly should not be among our highest expenses. This expense, swipe fees, is third only to labor and rent that we face. I applaud this committee for looking at ways to achieve robust competition in the use of credit and debit cards, similar to the robust competition we must take part in every day. I would be pleased to answer your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Corrett. Mr. Sheedy of Visa. Make sure that button.
Sorry.
Good.
Good morning, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. For more than 60 years, Visa has enabled people, businesses, and governments to make and receive payments through its secure transaction processing network. I am pleased to be able to share with the committee the many ways in which Visa works to promote safety, security, innovation, and competition to drive economic growth and financial inclusion. Recently, we have taken a number of important steps to support the economy and to maintain the security, reliability, and stability of our network. These steps are intended to help businesses of all sizes, including those that may be struggling due to the effects of the pandemic and consumers across the country. At the outset of the pandemic, we lowered interchange rates for certain key segments, including grocery stores, restaurants, and education. In April, we lowered interchange rates for the majority of U.S. businesses. Visa is also taking steps to make online payments more secure by encouraging the use of secure digital tokens so that transactions can be processed without sharing a cardholder's sensitive account information, and implementing changes designed to promote accurate transaction processing. As a payments network, Visa takes its role in setting interchange rates very seriously, with the goal of fostering balance, security, and stability while growing the overall payments ecosystem. It is important to note that Visa does not earn revenue from interchange fees. Our brand promise has always been rooted in being the best way to pay and be paid. We remain steadfast in our focus to deliver on this commitment. Our success is based heavily on investing in and continuously enhancing the security of our network, more so than any other part of our business. Trust and security are the foundation of everything we do. In the last 5 years, we have spent over $9 billion on fraud protection and security. In 2021 alone, our fraud prevention programs helped merchants and financial institutions prevent nearly $26 billion in fraud. Cardholders choosing Visa can count on our zero liability protections on unauthorized transactions. Visa stands behind every transaction with programs such as zero liability and efficient dispute resolution. Merchants who choose to accept Visa are guaranteed payment when a transaction is properly authorized on our network. Competitive pressures on Visa to maintain and improve upon its reliability, innovation, and security have never been more pressing. New competitors, new ways of paying, advances in security, as well as cyber risks are emerging at a dizzying pace. As consumers and merchants pay digitally more often, getting into payments has become as easy as developing and marketing an attractive app. The growing number of payment options now available at checkout, especially online, is a reflection of this competitive environment and the continued expansion of consumer and merchant choice in payments. In addition to cash, checks, and traditional U.S. payment networks, we also compete today with digital wallets, buy now, pay later solutions, fintech and big tech, real-time payment systems, and cryptocurrencies. With this massively changing competitive environment, Visa is even more clear about our first-order priority. Our success depends on our ability to deliver innovative, safer, more secure payments and a strong value proposition to consumers and merchants alike. Payments will continue to evolve through new payment uses, new business models, new frictionless commerce. However, regulatory interventions focusing exclusively on card networks could shift consumer spending away from networks like Visa and to more expensive payment methods with more risk, less reliability, and fewer protections and security. Visa is proud of our security and fraud-fighting tools. Another truly important benefit of our network is that we level the playing field between large and small players. The investments that we've made have enabled small retailers and community banks and credit unions to compete with larger merchants and larger banks to deliver robust capabilities, positive customer experiences, and security protections. This has created a vibrant, competitive environment that allows American and global economy to thrive and grow. We appreciate the opportunity to address the committee on these important issues, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sheedy. Ms. Kirkpatrick from Mastercard.
Good morning, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. I'm Linda Kirkpatrick, and I'm the President of North America at Mastercard. It is my pleasure to appear before you this morning to discuss three things. First, the value that Mastercard brings to merchants, banks, consumers, and governments. Second, recent interchange adjustments. And third, the robust competitive environment in which we operate. Having worked at Mastercard for 25 years, I can personally attest to the value that we bring to our stakeholders. Our role is to enable commerce in a safe and secure way. For banks, we provide products that support their customer base, allowing them to deepen relationships and extend financial tools to consumers. For credit unions who help people buy homes and start businesses, our products allow them to more effectively support their communities. The value we bring to banks is evidenced by the greater than 45% growth in cards in the US over the past 5 years. For merchants, electronic payments provide them with benefits and protections they don't receive from cash and check. In addition to increased sales and operational savings, merchants receive guaranteed payments, even when consumers don't pay their bills. Banks absorb these costs, which are on average higher than the average merchant cost of acceptance. Mastercard is deeply committed to small merchants. Within the first weeks of the pandemic, we announced a $250 million financial package to support them through this crisis. The value we bring to merchants is clearly demonstrated by the growth in global locations where our products are accepted, which has nearly doubled over the last 5 years. This includes an incremental 24 million small businesses since 2020. And for consumers, Mastercard products provide access, convenience, and peace of mind. Consumers are never responsible for fraudulent activity that may occur on their accounts. Further, electronic payments kept commerce alive for consumers and small businesses during the pandemic. In fact, the US government used our products to quickly deliver critical aid to vulnerable Americans. This value is clearly demonstrated by the spend on our products in the US, which has grown by nearly 60% over the past 5 years. To be clear, banks, merchants, and consumers are all critical stakeholders for Mastercard. Their success is our success, which is why we work so hard to find balance in the system. In particular, I have personally spent many years supporting and partnering with merchants across their co-brand portfolios and other services. As part of balancing the interests of all stakeholder groups, Mastercard sets default interchange rates, or the fees charged by cardholder banks to merchant banks for the benefit of guaranteed payments, transaction processing, and account servicing. Mastercard does not earn revenue from interchange, nor do we set the fee charged directly to the merchants. Our rates seek to incentivize both card issuance by banks and card acceptance by merchants. Without these rates, more than 90 million merchants would need individual contracts with thousands of banks, which would be impractical. In 2020, we announced our intent to adjust rates to reflect current market conditions and investments. These adjustments represented the first significant changes in over a decade. After a 2-year delay resulting from the pandemic, we implemented changes to our default rates, which included some increases and some decreases, including for small merchants. Based on our modeling, the net impact of these and other recent changes is virtually neutral to the ecosystem. Finally, I'd like to note that the payment industry has never been more competitive than it is today. In addition to cash and check, we aggressively compete with several global and regional networks, and increasingly with buy now, pay later providers, person-to-person and account-to-account services, real-time payment platforms, digital currencies, wallet providers, and other forms of payment. There is no question that the variety of payment options available to consumers is robust. Mastercard does not hold or exercise market power. We embrace consumer choice and have embedded this concept into our business strategy. In summary, we are deeply committed to supporting all of our stakeholders, including merchants, banks, governments, and consumers. And we are extremely proud of the way our products enable financial inclusion and choice to consumers and small businesses to help them thrive. I appreciate the committee's time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Kirkpatrick. Mr. Mirzwinski, please.
Thank you, Senator Durbin. Chair Durbin, Senator Grassley, members of the committee, I am Ed Mirzwinski. I'm with the U.S. Public Interest Research Group. We're a nonprofit consumer advocacy organization and serve as the national office for the state PIRGs. All consumers pay more at the store and more at the pump because of non-negotiable, non-transparent fees that are set by the card networks, not by the banks themselves. And I want to point out that when I testified in 2010, Chair Durbin, before your Appropriations Committee, that was on the matter that even the government couldn't negotiate the prices that it paid for buying and selling things on its government platforms. It's incredible to me that even the government is not big enough to hold Visa and MasterCard accountable. But the worst problem occurs if you're a small merchant having to pay your probably second highest price of cost of goods sold might be higher, rent might be higher, but probably bank fees are the next price, or the next highest fee that you pay. So what do you have to do? Because of the complicated rules that you discussed in your opening statement, Senator Durbin, the inches thick contracts, et cetera, they forbid the merchant from doing anything to lower the costs in his store. He's got no choice but to bake the price of these overpriced swipe fees into the costs that everybody pays, including the cash customers who might be low income, and they're probably subsidizing. And despite what all the associations and the networks will say today, the bulk of the interchange fee goes to pay for affluent consumer rewards cards. It does not go to the other important issues of security. Those are small items compared to rewards. So I'm very happy that you're holding this hearing, and I want to point out that there's really nothing to restrain these networks in this market failure that we have in the card network ecosystem. And when talking about percentage-based fees, when prices go up because of inflation, the bank earns more money without doing anything or without making anything. Visa, I believe, has been quoted recently in earnings calls in the press. Inflation is a net win for us. So it is a market failure. I want to commend the Durbin Amendment for going after some of the key aspects in the debit part of the system. First, you narrowly and proportionally, you capped fees to a reasonable and proportional basis on some debit cards, but not all. And second, you went after debit card routing, an important area that needs to be fixed. The Federal Reserve is also working on a debit card update to Rule II, which implemented the Durbin Amendment, and that would make it easier for merchants to pick and choose different networks that are not owned by the incumbent players. I want to point out that Europe and Canada are examples, many other examples around the world of places that regulate these fees much more aggressively across debit and credit networks. The fact is their interchange rates are lower and lower. I believe Europe's rates under the interchange fee regulation, IFR, I believe their rates are about 10% of US rates. US rates are not really restrained, and that's why we needed the Durbin Amendment. That's why we need to expand the Durbin Amendment. There have been some important actions taken by the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission doesn't have jurisdiction over banks, but it does have jurisdiction over the card networks. And the Federal Trade Commission has forced Visa to change the way that consumers are told about their choices in using swipe card machines. And the Department of Justice, in particular, went after Visa's acquisition of Plaid, a nascent competitor that does a lot of important work. So I look forward to working with the committee on other solutions, and I strongly support your talking about having a disclosure on your bank and credit card statement that says how many swipe fees you've paid. Consumers don't know what a swipe fee is, then they would know. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mirzwinski. Mr. Kim from Commerce Bank.
Good morning, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. I'm pleased to testify before you today on behalf of Commerce Bank team members who serve communities up and down America's heartland. Commerce is a mid-sized bank founded in Kansas City in 1865. We're honored to employ talented people in almost every state represented on this committee. We offer a full suite of payment services, including debit and credit cards for consumers and businesses, and merchant card acceptance services that keep money moving in those communities we're privileged to serve, as well as all over the world, 7/24, wherever our customers are traveling or shopping, something that would be impossible without Interchange and the networks. The views expressed in my testimony are broadly held among my colleagues at the thousands of mid-sized and community banks across the country. Just this week, letters have come to this committee signed by state banker associations, community banker associations, credit union leagues, and minority-owned banks, from small to large, from public to nonprofit mutual banks and cooperative credit unions owned by their depositors, urban, rural, and suburban. We're united in our view. Price controls in the form of interchange regulation like the Durbin Amendment harm consumers, harm small businesses, harm competition, and harm communities. So what is interchange, and is there a competition problem around it? Simply put, our payment system requires constant investment and protection, and we need a fair way to pay for it. I believe both banks and merchants should share in the cost of the payment system. Banks and credit unions invest billions into building and securing the payment system before, during, and after the sale. Merchants contribute to those costs by paying a small fee when they use the system to make a sale. That's interchange, and as a fee, it's just a convenient and proportional way to pay their share. When we compete for merchants' card business, it's extremely competitive. We're up against many players trying to give the merchant a slightly better deal. That used to mean just other banks selling a card terminal, but today there are many independent providers competing. I think the average merchant probably gets tired of hearing from people trying to sell merchant services. But cards aren't the only choices today. There's Venmo, PayPal, Square, Cash App, Clover, Toast, RTP, FedNow, Same Day ACH, Buy Now, Pay Later, new payment rails and merchant payment solutions at all price points, including free and some more costly than credit. A decade ago, my bank's executive chairman testified in the House and predicted that the Durbin Amendment would cause great harm to consumers and will affect banks of all sizes. Now the data's in and we can quantify the size of the harm and how the promises made about protecting community banks and lowering prices turned out to be empty. Many consumers have lost access to free checking, minimum balance and monthly fees are up, debit card rewards are scarcer or non-existent, and small merchants have seen their cost of accepting cards rise. These are findings of the federal banking regulators and respected academics. Per research from the Federal Reserve Board and Dr. Natasha Sarin, a University of Pennsylvania law professor who is now senior economic policy maker in the Biden Treasury Department, banks were 35 to 40% less likely to offer free checking accounts following the passage of the amendment. For the largest merchants, this law has been a windfall, and it's helped some get more market share, but for smaller businesses and financial institutions that can't tap into a law that encourages consolidation and scale, the costs have been steep. In fact, small banks and credit unions, which were prominently proclaimed as exempt from the price caps, we've seen their interchange revenue drop 30% per swipe on PIN debit transactions. This is a direct result of small issuers being covered by the law's backdoor price controls known as routing mandates. Merchants promised Congress they would reduce retail prices after the law passed, but the Fed found that nearly 99% of merchants did not pass on any savings to their customers. At the very least, this should make us skeptical about the current demands and the debit routing rules, should be expanded and extended to credit cards. Our nation needs to keep up when it comes to payments, technology, and security, and that won't happen if we cut the investment out of our own infrastructure. Countries like China and Russia are investing heavily in innovating their payment systems and will present a challenge to America's leadership in this key area of national and economic security. Yet policies like the Durbin Amendment create rigid rules and investment caps that limit our potential to do the same. The payments world is rapidly evolving, and smaller financial institutions are facing enormous costs to upgrade, offer new products, and just stay in the game. Interchange is an investment in American commerce, not a junk fee. I urge the committee to look at both sides of this story and put the consumer first. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. Mr. Cantor.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, members of the committee for having me here today and for having this hearing. We really appreciate the opportunity because we think this is an incredibly important issue. The credit card market is broken. Visa and Mastercard centrally set the fees that the banks that issue consumers cards charge. Those banks compete on every other price they set, every other interest rate they set, every other part of their business, but not here. They could do it here. They're very big institutions. This is an incredibly concentrated market with large institutions like JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo. None of them are setting their own prices. That doesn't make any sense. Then on top of that, Visa and Mastercard set the terms by which cards are accepted, which make sure to insulate those fees from any other competitive market pressure to make sure they can stay high. They have an honor all cards rule that says to merchants, if you want to take any single Visa or MasterCard, you must take every single one. And the prices on these cards can be incredibly different for these businesses. They can be factors of 2 or 3 times as high. By doing that and then restraining merchants' prices and the price signals that they can send to their consumers, they make sure there's no market pressures here. That's why we have a market failure. It doesn't have to be this way, and it shouldn't be this way. We need competition in this market. That's the bottom line. There's lots of discussion on this panel, and has been already this morning, about how many other forms of payment there are. This isn't about the other forms of payment. This is about credit cards, because thankfully we've had some reform of debit cards, which has been quite good. But on credit cards, we have not. The interesting thing is, as folks on the panel talk about, well, there's buy now, pay later, and there's cryptocurrencies, there's all these other things. Yes, there are, but installment loans and other things are not credit cards. They're conflating these different markets. Senator Grassley this morning talked about the rise in prices in different markets, beef, chicken, other products. Nobody on this committee would think it acceptable if there was a price-fixing scheme going on in the beef market that caused prices to be high, and someone else came in and said, well, don't worry, everyone can just eat chicken. It's okay, it's very competitive. That's not okay. We need to deal with the competition problem in credit cards to have a fair deal for merchants and consumers, and frankly, for the U.S. economy, because the $138 billion just last year that were charged in fees that consumers don't see, we all end up paying, and it does create this inflationary cycle, particularly because it is a percentage, most of it, a percentage of the transaction. So when there is inflation, that drives up prices. And look, we're not saying Visa and MasterCard caused inflation. They did not. Everybody can have their own opinions there, but it does exacerbate it, both because the fees are very high and because the percentage way that they're charged creates this inflation. And look, that's what we would all expect when there's no competition. It's very predictable. One other thing I would like to say on this is we've heard a couple things this morning about how there is a payment guarantee for merchants. There is not. The Federal Reserve, every couple of years, looks at debit fees in particular. And they have found that merchants pay 56% of the fraud on debit cards. 56%. Now, look, I don't know what everyone means by guarantee when they hear that word, but my gosh, paying 56% does not say to me that our members are getting a guarantee of payment. They're losing most of it when there's fraud being committed. So we need to have our facts straight when we talk about this, and we need to have competition in this market. We all know that competition does work. It works throughout our economy. We don't let folks set other people's prices in a centralized way in other parts of the economy. When we have that type of competition, prices are lower. We have more innovation. Frankly, we've seen more innovation since the Durbin Amendment on debit cards with more encryption and other security types of innovations that came right afterward. And people have more money in their pockets. When there's competition and lower prices, they can spend more, and that consumer spending helps drive the economy. So I really appreciate the committee looking at this important issue and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Mr. Cantor. We'll have 5-minute rounds of questions, and I'll start. It turns out that the issue of inflation was addressed directly by the Chief Financial Officer of Visa. I hope I pronounce his name correctly, Vasant Prabhu. On January 27th earnings call, he was asked how inflation impacts Visa. His answer, and I quote, "Net, I mean, we are a beneficiary of inflation." He also said, quote, "To the extent that there's inflation driving up ticket size, clearly it's beneficial to us." So let's put to rest the theory that this has nothing to do with inflation. It appears to have some relevance. Can I ask you, Mr. Sheedy, incidentally, Ms. Corrett told us that coincidentally, April 22nd was chosen by both Visa and Mastercard as the day to raise the fees. Was that just a coincidence or coordination? Can you turn on your feet? Turn on your mic, please. Thank you.
Apologize. Senator, we did not raise the fees in April. In fact, 90% of businesses in the United States see a change in their rates that were down by 10% effective with the April changes.
Ms. Corrett, were you wrong?
No, we calculated, we got a 300-page amendment or a fee schedule. We calculated exactly the fee increases for us. And while some fees went down, others went up significantly. The net effect is our fees went up.
Both companies the same day?
Yes.
Mr. Sheedy, here's a customer who has some evidence otherwise. May I ask you, Ms. Kirkpatrick, you're in charge of Mastercard North America. I want to ask you about these crazy Canadians. How in the world can you explain this? In Canada, there's a debit card system called Interact. It is the most widely used debit card system in Canada. It reports it has one of the lowest rates of fraud globally. The website for Interact says, and I quote, "Interchange for Interact debit is currently set at 0. How is it possible these crazy Canadians are getting no charge of interchange fees on debits and have less fraud? How can that possibly be?"
Well, Senator, it's not the case that Canadian merchants don't have interchange fees. There's value
in the debit cards.
There is value in the debit space that consumers derive from transacting at merchants, and there's value that the merchants
What do you mean by value?
receive.
You're going to have to define terms.
When merchants shop at a Canadian, when consumers shop at Canadian merchants, they receive value through the form of guaranteed payment, lower risk, purchasing power. And so therefore, there are interchange fees on debit transactions in Canada, and it's a direct result of the value that those merchants are delivering and that consumers are deriving.
Mr. Mirzwinski noted what's happening in Europe, so let's stick with the program for a minute. Try to explain to me the difference in debit and credit card interchange fees in Europe, where the European Union has set a standard of 0.2% and 0.3% respectively, 1/8 or 1/10 of which is charged in the United States. Clearly, their system is much different than ours, and we have no regulation. Other countries like Australia, Brazil, China, India, Israel, Malaysia, and South Korea also limit interchange fees. So what lessons can we learn from all of these countries who've decided that interchange fees are way too high in the United States?
Well, I think those countries know that the credit card system is a market failure, and the ways that the banks are forced to accept all of the fees from the networks and the consumers are forced to pay increased prices, they're not going to have it. They're not going to have it, and they said no. And U.S. Congress should strengthen the Durbin Amendment, expand it to credit cards, and lower interchange across the board.
Make sure I understand the scope of interchange fees. If I decided that I wanted to give money to Catholic Charities for the people, Ukrainian refugees in Poland, and I use my credit card or debit card to make that donation, would you be collecting an interchange fee on that transaction, Mr. Kirkpatrick?
The interchange fees for Mastercard does have interchange fees, or the banks do charge interchange fees to consumers, or rather to merchants, across all transactions for the benefit that the consumers are receiving from that transaction. So there's a cost associated with servicing that transaction and servicing that account.
And the interchange fees also apply to sales tax I'm paying on my restaurant bill?
It does.
Why?
It's the total value that the consumers are deriving when they shop at a merchant.
A tax on a tax.
It's the total value. So you can't just look at interchange as one.
More than a total value.
As one element. You're looking at the total cost of servicing that account, which includes fraud, guaranteed payment, increased purchasing power, and the ability to use that product anywhere Mastercard is accepted.
And we look at it across the world where interchange fees are regulated and restrained, and we don't see this rampant fraud. Senator Grassley?
You know, before my 5 minutes starts, I'd ask unanimous consent to add several letters from stakeholders into the record.
Without objection.
As of 2020, statistics show that Visa and Mastercard combined for 84% of all general purpose credit cards within the United States. Some have characterized this as a duopoly, able to extract above market payments for their services. So to Mr. Sheedy and Ms. Kirkpatrick, what would be your response to these concerns? And do Visa and Mastercard abuse market power? And then I'd like to have Mr. Cantor and Mr. Corrett listen and then respond. Mr. Sheedy, you want to start out?
Yes, Senator, thank you. Senator, we operate in a highly competitive market. Merchants have never had more choice at the checkout. Consumers have never had more choices to be able to pay. And one of the things that I think is important to understand about our payments network and the level playing field that we set with interchange is the same interchange flows through our network and gets passed to, in the same exact manner, to thousands of financial institutions across the United States, small banks and small credit unions to larger players. And they all compete with one another and innovate in that complex, very dynamic marketplace. And ultimately, the consumer wins from that competition. And when the consumer is empowered to transact with products that are tailored for them, and investments are made in the system to manage risk and keep the system secure with a high integrity, and that consumer's empowered to shop at the point of sale, the merchant benefits from that flow. So it's that balance that we're trying to accomplish, and any notion that we're not operating in a highly competitive market, we fundamentally disagree with.
Do you have anything to add, Ms. Kirkpatrick?
Yeah, I'd say the payments ecosystem has never been more competitive than it is today. In addition to the networks, as I discussed earlier, there are competition that comes from buy now, pay later providers, wallet providers, digital currencies, regional debit networks. The definition of market power is really an institution that can raise prices while also reducing consumption. And Mastercard's motivations are the exact opposite. We are motivated to drive more transactions through our network. That is how we generate revenue. That is how we win. So by virtue of that, we are incentivized to create balance across all stakeholders, both merchants and banks. If we set interchange rates too high, merchants won't accept. If we set interchange rates too low, banks won't issue. And so therefore, our goal is balance, and our goal is consumer value.
Mr. Cantor, and then Ms. Corrett.
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, that's not the way it works. This is not a balancing of the marketplace because, look, economists at the Kansas City Federal Reserve have looked at this, and they've said because merchants and retail in the United States are so competitive, these fees can get set well beyond any semblance of value up until the only break point is where the retailers would actually lose money and go under for accepting the cards. And that's the one break point. And look, in other markets, we don't say because something has great value, we allow price setting centrally rather than competitive market prices to rule the day. As you talked about in your opening statement with beef prices and chicken prices and others, just because those are valuable products, many of us need to eat them, right, to survive, really important, but we wouldn't say, oh, then they can just centrally fix the prices, and that's okay. There needs to be a market system to discipline those prices. We don't have that here, and frankly, the innovation in other kinds of technologies and payments does not make up for the lack of innovation and the antitrust problem in credit cards. In fact, it really shines an incredible spotlight on the fact that we have not had that type of innovation in credit cards, and those haven't advanced. And the market power of Visa and Mastercard have been incredibly stubborn, and they've held on to that market, including ever since the Department of Justice won a Second Circuit decision finding, cert denied in the Supreme Court, that both Visa and Mastercard have market power in this market.
Ms. Corrett, add, but don't repeat.
I'll do my best. Thank you. I'd like to come at this from a slightly different angle. Our average store carries over 50,000 items, every single one of which is negotiated in terms of price, how we market it, how we merchandise it. When Procter & Gamble comes to talk to us about selling Tide, of which there are, let's say, 50 different sizes and flavors of it, they don't come in and say, you have to take all 50. They don't come in and say, take it or leave it. They don't come in and say, you can't promote it. You can't incent people to do one thing versus the other. Visa and MasterCard effectively control over 80% of the credit market, and they are the only vendor which we cannot negotiate with. And it's a take it or leave it proposition, and that, again, I'm not an economist, so I don't know what technically qualifies as a duopoly. That said, to me, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck.
I have two questions I'll submit for answer in writing.
Thank you. On the Democratic side, the order on early bird rules, Blumenthal, Whitehouse, Coons, and Hirono, and I note the presence of Senator Tillis. So at this point, it'd be Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to Senator Durbin for his leadership on this issue over many years, and all of us who have served at the state level. I served as State Attorney General for a number of years, as Mr. Mirzwinski knows, are deeply grateful to you for your leadership. I'm just a country lawyer from Connecticut. And Ms. Corrett, I spent a lot of time on the road in Connecticut. I spent a lot of time in convenience stores and pumping gas, and I hear and see the anger of consumers when they go to pay for what they buy. I know that the credit card companies are not the only ones responsible for the skyrocketing prices at the pump or any of the other commodities. There are big oil companies, and we're gripped by their greed. They prioritize shareholder profits and keep supply constrained and drive prices higher. That's one of the reasons that I've helped to spearhead with Senator Whitehouse a measure called the Big Oil Windfall Profits Tax Act, which would establish a tax on industry profiteering and lower consumer costs with relief rebates. But I am struck in your testimony that the vast majority of gas for American consumers has seen its fees rise by as much as 26.5%. Consumers in Connecticut are hit by that increase in fees. 26.5% increase in a single year as they are struggling with these higher prices. Now, I understand that the card industry says that they've imposed a cap on those fees at $1.10, but that doesn't adequately protect consumers, does it?
So, Senator, it's a wonderful question, and you've asked, it's a very complex subject, as you know, because we're dealing with global economy issues. Specifically, what would you like me to respond to?
What I would like to know is how are consumers impacted by that 26.5% increase?
So, as we all know, the retail price of gas is at historical highs right now, but that's directly related to the commodity market, where the price of a barrel of oil is also at historical highs. It wasn't so long ago that oil was at, between $60 and $70 a barrel. At some point early on in the Ukraine war, oil hit $140 a barrel. Retail pricing in gasoline is one of the most competitively dynamic markets that I am aware of. And we follow street pricing, and the margins are impacted as the cost of goods go up. So do the retail prices.
Let me ask Mr. Cantor the same question.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I think it's a really important question. Our members sell about 80% of all the gasoline across the country, including in Connecticut. We have some wonderful members doing that there. The Energy Information Administration has looked specifically at gasoline pricing, and they divided up the country into the different regions and found that there is 100% pass-through of both cost increases and cost decreases into the retail price of gasoline in every region of the country. And so these fees, without question, get paid by consumers every day. And I will tell you, 26.5%, it's an unbelievably high increase. Our members are reporting to us that this year their fees are up much more than that. We had a member we talked to this week, their fees are up 49% this year. This is completely unsustainable in an industry where we know people are upset about gas prices. And just by the way, for the retailers themselves, as gas prices go higher, their margins get smaller, and the FTC has documented this, but the fees get higher at the same time. We have members literally, some during the past few months, who have sold at no margin just to try to keep some market share.
The term has been used by the two officials from Visa and Mastercard that this market has never been more competitive, that it's highly competitive, but they're including in the market different companies like apples and oranges, correct?
That's exactly right.
And let me ask you, what can the FTC do in the absence of legislation? Can it act to try to foster competition?
The FTC has investigated and done some good things. For example, when there were problems with the way Visa and Mastercard controlled what was happening with the payment card terminals that accepted EMV chip cards. They've had some other open investigations about actions by Visa and Mastercard to try to block the competition on debit cards. So there's some things they can do, but they are limited because they don't have jurisdiction over the banking industry. The Department of Justice had taken some action as well. In fact, their antitrust division has perhaps brought more cases in the payments area than any other area over time. But as you know, litigation is hard. It takes a very long time. And it's really best at finding compensation for past problems. Really, Congress is best at designing, well, what's the way for the future to look in terms of having a competitive market that functions?
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Anytime we're looking at a competition issue, I'm always interested in how it affects consumers. And representing my state as I do, I'm always concerned about how things affect Utahns. Utahns have suffered to a particularly acute degree as a result of the rampant inflation that has resulted from excessive federal spending. Since the beginning of last year, Utahns have seen their monthly expenses go up more than $700 a month, just their ordinary monthly expenses. We're talking $8,400 plus per year just to buy the same basket of goods and services that they were purchasing before, but it's all more expensive now. So whenever approaching this or any other topic in the competition phase, I'm looking at how this would affect them, how it does affect them, and what, if anything, we ought to do about it. And with that in mind, Mr. Sheedy, let's start with you. There are those who have argued that it's anti-competitive, cartel behavior for banks through the Visa and Mastercard networks to get together and collectively agree that they're all going to charge the same interchange fees to merchants. What's your response to that?
Senator, Visa sets the interchange fees, these default interchange fees that pass from merchants, acquiring banks to issuing banks. We do that on our own. We don't do that with, we certainly do it with input from the marketplace. The impact that the pandemic has had on merchants has been really important to us. At the front end of the pandemic, we lowered rates for supermarkets, restaurants, and education merchants. More recently, 90% of the merchants in the system will receive a 10% reduction in the rates that they process. What's really important, I think I'd like to stress, is we are not raising rates. The average rate in our system for Visa credit has been flat since 2015.
No, I get that, and I've got a limited time. I just want to be clear what I'm asking. I'm asking you to respond specifically to the charge that it amounts to cartel behavior to agree to charge the same interchange fees.
We disagree, Senator. The setting of a default interchange fee, we feel, is highly competitive in the ways in which it delivers the same interchange fee to thousands of financial institutions that then go into the marketplace on behalf of consumers and merchants and compete and innovate. So we feel that the model works very well in a system where you need tens of thousands of banks supporting millions of cardholders and millions of merchants. There's no way to operate the system other than setting a default interchange fee.
For there to be a network effect, in other words, you need the network effect in order for your system to work.
In order for there to be a coordination of activity where consumers can transact from a card that's issued by a credit union in Utah with a merchant in New York online or in person, you need to have a default interchange fee so that you know how the economic flows are going to work. And having that be the same interchange fee, irrespective of the size of the financial institution, promotes competition.
Mr. Cantor, what's your response to that?
Yeah, my response is, one, they don't need to do that. I submitted with my testimony an article from NYU economist Nicholas Economides, who's pointed out that because of the concentration in the market, both on the issuing side and on the acquiring merchant side, that just 90 contracts would cover 72% of all the credit card volume. Those big banks could easily set their own prices. You don't need that going on, and there's been much more concentration since then. The other thing I would note is that having the same fees does not promote level playing field competition on the bank side either. John Blum from the Community Bankers testified previously before Congress in hearings that their costs per transaction, because they're a smaller institution, were much higher than the largest banks. But if you lock them into the same prices on higher costs, of course, they're not going to be able to compete in the same way. And those large banks have won over a lot of those small bank customers into the credit card market, which is why credit cards is so much more concentrated than debit cards as a result of that.
Mr. Kim, go with me, and if you want to respond to this, that's great too, but I was also going to ask you separately, what would happen to credit card rewards in a universe in which you imagine that there's suddenly an alternative network through which merchants could process transactions?
So the interchange pays for, I think, roughly 60% of interchange revenue goes out in the form of rewards. And I do believe it goes, not just to the wealthy. Everybody loves the rewards. I think it's a much more broadly distributed value that people of all socioeconomic classes find. And in debit, there were debit rewards before the laws changed, and those debit rewards largely went away because interchange helped subsidize those things. So you would see those rewards go away. And furthermore, you would see banks of my size and smaller and maybe even somewhat larger, the economics of issuing credit cards, it's not what it once was. There's lots of competition. It's harder to do. The big banks, it's interesting to come back to the last question. Yeah, maybe you could cover, I don't even know that I agree that the largest banks could negotiate with all the millions of merchants and set the interchange. But if they could, that would just put me out because I can't.
Mr. Chairman, I see my time's expired. I've got one follow-up question I want to ask on that. Okay, so if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying the banks would still get paid for that transaction, but get paid less, and likely rewards programs would be a casualty of them. There might be something left of them, there might not.
Yeah, I would, depending on the rate, I assume we'd get paid, yeah.
Okay, so if that's the case, couldn't one argue that this is a manifestation of lack of competition, and that the price is being artificially inflated by lack of competition? The consumer rewards provide a means of sharing in the monopoly, monopoly rents, you might say, in order to inflate demand and squeeze merchants. What's your response to that?
The purpose of rewards is not to squeeze merchants. The purpose of rewards is so that you have a value proposition that makes people want to use your card. And the competition, the reward space is an intensely competitive space. And again, it's hard for a bank my size to compete with the likes of Chase that strikes a deal with Southwest Airlines. Perhaps that continues. It wouldn't be as rich. But again, it kind of puts me out.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Lee. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to you and the ranking member for convening this conversation today. I am glad to see that on this panel we have represented the whole range of potential input, consumers, consumer advocates, networks, merchants, and a bank that is a credit card issuer. Clearly, I think we have to look at all of these four different sides of the credit card transaction universe when attempting to assess whether or not there's sufficient competition, what capping fees would do, and what the consequences might be. Mr. Kim, I'm glad you're able to testify today and provide a bank issuer's perspective. I've heard from credit unions, community banks, large banks in my state that are credit card issuers, and they depend on interchange fees in order to be able to support the credit cards that they offer to consumers. Credit unions and community banks in particular are concerned that a substantial decrease in interchange would mean they could no longer sustain card programs that extend credit to individuals who might otherwise not be able to access credit cards. So I think the issue here isn't just losing rewards programs, but losing access to credit and losing the ability of smaller issuers to participate and compete at rates that are lower than you might get from major cards. How do issuing banks rely on interchange to offer credit services? And what impact would it be if that revenue substantially declined for your bank?
Okay, I think you're on the nose there with your comments. So, interchange is one source of revenue. Interest and fees on the credit card are another source of revenue. If that, and one of the things that makes this lending, making small loans is very expensive. That's why you don't see a lot of people doing it. That's why it moves online where the costs are lower. And so we've been pushed. A lot of banks have been pushed out of the business because the revenue stream's just not there. And in fact, the interchange used to make it a more profitable business, but in fact, now that we pay the rewards out to the consumers, it's squeezed that as well. So I think what you would see, so the very smallest of banks, they depend on larger banks like us to help them issue credit cards. So the margins there are even thinner. And I think you would just see that element of competition of issuing cards from the smallest institutions, from credit unions, from mid-sized banks. I think you'd see that just go away, and it would be the larger banks that have the scale that can still do business in a profitable way.
One of the challenges I've also heard from retailers in my state, family-owned grocery store, that their margins are so small that for them to pay an increase in interchange or swipe fees, this is where you sit depends on where you're listening to. On fraud and data breach, one of the concerns I've heard from a credit union in Dover, Delaware, is that covering the costs of reissuing cards, of investigating, of paying off the costs associated with a major data breach are not sustainable for a credit union or a small bank without interchange. Mr. Sheedy, is that something you've seen in your experience, Ms. Kirkpatrick?
I'll start. Senator, the situation with fraud and cyber risk and the risks associated with merchants and consumers transacting online is an enormous issue. A decade or so, we had a similar magnitude of risk at the point of sale with counterfeit cards that had been generated primarily on the part of data that had been breached by merchants and cyber criminals. We addressed that with rolling out chip cards and chip terminals. We have the same issue facing us now online. And there's roughly $10 billion of fraud annually online with merchants and consumers transacting in a way that generates fraud. And among the changes that we're making have made in April is to encourage the adoption of secure digital tokens that will authenticate the consumer and provide more guarantees and more assurance to the merchants so that we can address that fraud. It will require the merchants to do their part. We've invested $9 billion, as I've mentioned, in the last 5 years in fraud and security protections. Issuers are also investing. We have to make the same type of push to address this fraud online that we did in the physical point of sale with chip cards.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Cantor wants to address that before
Senator, if I could, actually, you raised some really important points, I think, in your earlier comments that I thought would be helpful, because we do have a track record around the world of some reforms, and we haven't found in other parts of the world the parade of problems that Mr. Kim and some of his brethren talk about. In other parts of the world, credit has still been available. Credit cards have still been used very frequently. And there's still rewards and all those sorts of things. And I also did just want to clarify that we as merchants, and Laura Corrett was clear about this in her testimony, we've not asked for a cap on credit card fees. This is a different market where we think there needs to be competition. Competition and market prices will help us here in ways that get at the types of problems you're worried about.
Could I ask a closing question, Mr. Chairman? I just would be interested, Mr. Mirzwinski, Mr. Kim, Mr. Cantor, if you could just briefly speak to this question. Now that we have a decade of experience in what happened with capping fees for debit, do we know whether the imposition of interchange fee caps led to lower prices for consumers and better access for lower income borrowers, consumers, in terms of low-cost banking services? Mr. Mirzwinski, if I might, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you for the question, Senator. I think that there are a lot of pressures on banks to lower the prices and to provide better services to lower-income consumers. And a lot of that is being done through partnerships between banks and consumer advocates. And but on the issue of bank fees and the price of banking, I think the banks always look to figure out a way to blame the latest regulation, and they love to blame the Durbin Amendment. I can't believe that the numbers are there to say that the Durbin Amendment has hurt lower income or all Americans. It's just, I don't see it.
Chairman Durbin, my hunch is I should probably conclude this question at this point. But I'd be grateful if Mr. Kim, Mr. Cantor could briefly speak to it.
Sure, let them.
Briefly.
I would just say, yeah, debit interchange is part of a checking account, and checking accounts have become more expensive for consumers. When that income went away, we had to look harder at how we did business and how we priced things in order to make up for that. And I would say, lastly, in terms of like access to rewards and things, people with debit cards frequently are the more credit challenged folks. They can't get a credit card. Their rewards went away that they got on debit cards. And I would say that's got to be limiting access.
Mr. Cantor?
Thank you, Senator Coons. Yeah, so consumers have saved tremendously. If you look at over the first 5 years of the Durbin Amendment being implemented, the producer price index that tracks wholesale costs that retailers pay was up 9.4%. The consumer price index that retailers charge to consumers was only up 4.3%. So there was still inflation, small amounts, but there was tremendous consumer savings in that spread, and retail profit margins did not budge or go up in the slightest. You know, this is something we should put to rest here because it's a really good question. Retail in the United States is one of the most competitive markets there is in the United States or around the world. Those profit margins, Alora's industry survives on 1.11% profit margins. The banking profit margins are over 30%, the highest industry sector that's tracked that way. It's remarkable. Either one of two things is happening when the credit card industry argues that consumer prices don't flow through and costs don't flow through. Either they don't believe competitive markets work, or they've been living so long with centrally setting the fees that they've forgotten how competitive markets actually work. Retail is unbelievably competitive.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your forbearance and for the broad range of testimony at today's hearing.
Thanks, Senator Coons. And let me add, for the record, I'm sure you're well aware, the infamous Durbin Amendment did exempt banks with lower than $10 billion in assets. That would not apply to Mr. Kim's bank. But for those, the Federal Reserve reported in 2021 that small banks and credit unions received 53.49% of total debit interchange fee revenue in 2019, $13 billion, even though they only conducted 35% of the total number of debit transactions. It turns out the infamous Durbin Amendment was a boon to the small banks and credit unions. Thank you. I believe Senator Tillis and Senator Washburn have worked, or Senator Blackburn have worked out an agreement.
Senator Blackburn.
Senator Blackburn?
No, go ahead.
You need to go.
I'm going to stick around anyway.
You're going to stick well, thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to stay, Mr. Kim, let me come to you on this. I saw you shaking your head about banking profits, and let's continue with that. Do you want to?
Sure. I think those statistics, a lot of times banks look at their revenue as net interest income.
Okay.
And so I think that 30 or 40% applies if you but if you go to, you think about the grocer pays a lot for their costs. So it doesn't account for the cost of money. And so when you do that, the profit margin becomes lower.
All right. And Ms. Carrott, let me come to you. I've talked to retailers and heard from some retailers that talk about they have to eat this cost. And they say it's most harmful to smaller businesses, the mom and pops. And when I talk to people who are in the grocery and convenience store business, they talk a good bit about this because this is something that drives up the overall cost of doing business and compliance, correct?
Senator, yes, thank you. Just to put this in perspective, picking up on what was said earlier, we operate on about a 1% profit margin.
Okay, so talk to me a little bit about how this contributes to this out-of-control inflation that we have. Because right now, inflation's at over a 40-year high. you've got the cost of milk and eggs and bacon and coffee. Coffee's up over 100% when you're buying a bag of beans. So talk a little bit about that added cost and the impact on the consumer, your consumer.
So the way the credit card swipe fees work is they're percentages.
Right?
When the price of goods go up, what's happening is the credit card companies are getting a higher percentage on a higher sale.
Right.
So that means there's more costs that we have to bear and pass along to our customers.
So that means the price on the shelf for a package of Oreos is going to cost more this summer.
That is absolutely correct.
When they're packing lunches for kids to go to camp and making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and putting a couple of cookies in there.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right. Now, Mr. Kim, I want to talk with you. I had read the GAO study that talked about the harmful impact of the Durbin Amendment. And the comment was that it was one of the most harmful laws and regulations in terms of its negative impact on the availability of fundamental banking services. So give me the explanation of how this has adversely impacted the unbanked, the underbanked.
Yeah, so I would kind of come back to the idea that, a lot of the underbanked and unbanked, or not necessarily unbanked, underbanked would use debit cards. Would use debit cards. The underbanked would use debit cards, and that contributed to the revenues associated with those checking accounts and those services that we offer them. Those revenues went away, and it forced us to increase the costs on those accounts. And so what you saw in the banking industry was a decline in the amount of free checking that was offered. Now, the banking industry is resilient, and we figure out how to overcome things, and over time, just like Ms. Corrett probably can do the same thing in her business. You figure out ways to overcome challenges, and now I think the banking industry has a good record of offering services to the underbanked, and so we've worked our way through that.
How did this affect your total customer mix? Did your customer base grow? Did it, as people moved to debit cards?
We probably saw sort of a just our own statistics. We probably saw sort of a stagnation there. So there's not as much appeal at the lower end where the big numbers are.
And so, a change to the credit routing system what kind of impact would that have?
I would say what that would do is reduce the money available associated with offering credit cards. It's kind of an expensive proposition for somebody our size, and it's been a declining profitability business for a number of years for a number of reasons: competition, regulation. It's the most regulated business we're in. We spend the most money on compliance officers and responding to regulators in that business. And there's a lot you can get in trouble if you do something wrong, and we'd get out.
Right. My time is expiring. Ms. Kirkpatrick, I've got a question for you, but as a courtesy, I will submit it because I want to know what your cost is because you accept the responsibility for loss, for fraud, for things of that nature. I'd like to know that percentage, what that means to Mastercard each year, how much that costs you.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Before I recognize Senator Hirono, I'd ask consent to enter into the record the report of the American Bankers Association that in 2010, the year the Durbin Amendment was enacted, 53% of Americans had free checking. 5 years later, under the Durbin Amendment, the American Bankers Association reports that the majority of Americans now, 61%, have free checking. So free checking has gone up and not down. Senator Hirono?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to know that the Durbin Amendment had some very positive impacts. So thank you. Although I was told that I actually signed a letter when I was in the U.S. House that raised questions about your amendment, but it's good to know that it all worked out. Oh, goodness gracious. Okay, Mr. Mirzwinski. You described in your opening statement how credit card fees lead to higher prices for consumers, and I saw an estimate that the average American family spends $700 a year as a result of higher prices due to credit card fees. And you said that the bulk of the interchange fees goes to rewards programs, and I was looking at a chart that is 2019, but the chart shows that based on the household income, the lower the household income, the greater the use of cash for payments and debit cards. So, for example, according to this chart in 2019, if you made under $25,000 in household income, you generally paid with cash 55% of the time, 5% credit, and 31% debit. And then if you're making over $200,000, then it would be 10% cash, 65% credit, 15% debit. So based on what you testified, most of these reward fees go to higher income people. Is that correct?
That's exactly right, Senator. And the Federal Reserve economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston have done studies that show the same thing. Essentially, the worst off Americans, people that don't have credit or debit cards, pay these swipe fees, pay these increased swipe fees, because merchants, due to the rules that are imposed on them by the dominant duopoly, Mastercard and Visa, they can't do anything else but to bake the fees into all of the costs that all consumers pay, including low-income Americans.
And then while some of the really large companies like Amazon and Walmart may be able to negotiate for lower interchange fees, small businesses don't have that kind of power.
That's exactly right, and thank you for that.
So for Ms. Carrette and Mr. Cantor, I have a series of questions relating to the honor all cards rule. First of all, can somebody just briefly tell me what that is? And then what impact does this rule have on the fees paid by merchants and often passed on to consumers? And would the elimination of this rule result in greater competition and lower fees?
So the honor all card pretense is that if you take Mastercard or Visa, you have to take all of their products. So there are lower fee products and higher fee products. As a just FYI, the higher fee products tend to be the reward cards that we're talking about. Something that I think you should know is that Visa and Mastercard are actively transferring customers into the higher rewards cards. So we end up paying a higher fee overall.
So a merchant can't say, I'm only going to accept this type of Visa or
Correct.
Mastercard.
That's correct.
And isn't that a tying case?
So, Senator,
Somebody mentioned antitrust.
yeah, Senator.
Yes.
So, interestingly, there's two pieces to this honor all cards rule, both of which are a problem. One is that you have to take, if you're a merchant, every single type of card, even if they're very expensive, to take the least expensive one, and that is destructive of competitive markets on the rates on those cards. But the second one also is, you have to accept the cards from every banking institution under the Visa and MasterCard umbrellas if you want to take any of them. And what that does is it tells these banking institutions, even the largest ones, that they no longer have any incentive to go to a merchant and say, hey, how about we come up with a deal to do business together? Because all the merchants are required to anyway. And that's what's so destructive of this competitive market and why it inflates fees to such a large degree.
So if we were to eliminate this rule, would that lead to, well, I think you just answered my question, would it lead to greater competition?
There's no question it would lead to more competition. There are quite a few other rules, including the setting of the prices, that are problematic here that have to get dealt with, but that is one of the central things getting in the way of real market competition.
Did you want to add something, Ms. Carrette? Okay. So in a situation like that, I think there might have been a case that went before the Supreme Court where a merchant said, I don't want to take all these, have to take all these different kinds of cards from one entity. So that might be an area for us to explore, to eliminate this honor all cards rule. Wouldn't merchants like that, especially small merchants?
We think that would be a great area to explore, to open up the market, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rono. Senator Tillis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do not want to suggest that I would malign the Durbin Amendment. I think like all policy around here, some of it worked, some of it may not work. We always got to look at refreshing things based on the circumstances of the day. Mr. Kim, just to go back to the GAO report, can you talk about just a little bit more about the effect that the Durbin Amendment has had on banking in general? The things that you're most concerned with? Give me the top two, if you have two.
So the GAO report, you don't have to take my word for it. Take the Government Accountability Office, found it was among the top 5 laws and regulations most cited as having significantly affected the cost and availability of basic banking services. So that's a statement. There's other arguments about those things, but that's a fact.
As you're going through this, also the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond indicated that nearly 99% of the savings realized from the Durbin Amendment were not passed back to the consumer. I mean, I think we're here ostensibly, I'm not a cheerleader for businesses, I'm a cheerleader for consumers. And so I'm trying to figure out if we're considering policy here that's going to have a net benefit to the consumer, it would suggest that the Durbin Amendment didn't. Is that accurate?
That's what that study would say. That's what the facts in that study would say. Now, figuring out exactly how price changes are passed on is a complicated thing, and the Durbin Amendment's been a long time ago, but that is the fact in the study.
I want Mr. Cantor, if you want to briefly respond, although I'm the last one here, so I may be able to indulge the chairman a little bit. Not too long, but.
Yeah, so there's two quick things. One, on the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, they made clear, actually, it does not say what some of the credit card industry says. Their study was a survey, didn't look at any actual economics of pass-through. They just did a survey of folks. And so it could not be relied on to say whether it was pass-through or not. And they also had bias issues they flagged in their survey.
Could it be fair to say, though, that if it's at 99%, there may have been an unhealthy amount that didn't go back to the consumers?
No, because they also asked the question wrong. See, merchants don't set their prices by saying, hey, this cost went down, now I'm lowering this price. What they say is, what's the market? And I got to compete with the guy down the street. And so over time, their profit margins become very narrow, like Ms. Kurpreck indicated, and it goes down to their cost. We all know that's how competitive markets work. So asking it was the wrong way to get at it.
I want to get to something else. I just want to see if my first impression, when we talk about the dollar amount increasing as the transaction amount increases, is it also fair to say, Mr. Sheedy, Ms. Kirkpatrick, that there's also a proportionate amount of risk and potential default in payments involved? I mean, isn't a part of the rationale behind the percentage going up is that there's a risk of fraud in some of those, that you've got to recapture it, right?
Yeah, that assumption is correct. As volumes increase, the risk of fraud increases, and we've seen.
Talk a little bit about card not present and additional rising costs in the area of the internet transactions, and additional risk that you've got to recoup some of the cost or you can't have an operational business, something that's important for our consumers.
Yeah, Mastercard is spending billions of dollars to protect consumers against online fraud. And certainly as volume increases, fraudsters get more sophisticated. And that means that Mastercard has to invest more to protect against that fraud. And we've spent billions of dollars to protect consumers against fraud. Just last year, one of our cyber and security tools prevented $10 billion in fraud for consumers across the card-not-present environment.
Mr. Sheedy? And then I'm going to come, Ms. Corrett, I'm saving you for last.
Oh, great.
Senator, thank you. The consumers want to transact online. They enjoy the convenience. Merchants find that they can reach new customers and lower their costs to provide services online. The difficulty is the way that the system works at the moment, as safety and security has been our high priority, there's still too much fraud, there's still too much uncertainty. So one of the changes that we're making in April then we created an incentive through Interchange. Interchange just isn't a pass-through. It's also a mechanism by which we can make the system more safe and more secure. With one of the changes that we made in April, we are seeing a rapid adoption of these secure digital tokens to better authenticate transactions online so that consumers and merchants can more safely and assuredly transact. That's good for everybody. It's good for merchants, good for consumers.
Isn't it fair to say that if we were to go in and dramatically decrease what you could charge to recoup the cost of your operations, that you'd have to take a look at the risk mix of people that you'd be even willing to issue credit cards to? I mean, wouldn't some of the most credit challenged people be hurt the most by this if you're having to make a business decision about the population you could serve?
Well, one way to answer your question, Senator, is when Interchange has been price regulated by governments around the world and other markets, you see a narrowing of the issuance of credit cards in those countries. And those fees to those consumers end up going up, and the features and the benefits they get from those cards go down. Yep. And we think that would be a horrible outcome.
Ms. Corrette, I'm very sensitive. We got a lot of retailers in North Carolina, across the nation, a lot of the recipients of Paycheck Protection Program, a number of other things that we implemented in response to the impact of COVID was to recognize that we've got a lot of businesses out there on the bubble. And I know that your sector is struggling mightily with some of the shutdowns and other things that we've been dealing with. But let's assume that the fees were cut in half. Would that solve all your problems in your industry? Or the answer and the laugh is all I needed. I mean, a part of what we need to do, if we're talking about having a meaningful impact and a reduction in consumer prices, there's a lot of other policies that we have to talk about here. It's not going to make a big difference. You've got a lot of supply chain problems. You've got a lot of inflationary problems. Tell me a little bit about if you could ask Congress to act on any policy matter that would help the retail industry, would this be in the top of the list, or are there other things that we should be looking at to fix the fundamental problems that businesses like yours are suffering through?
Senator, thank you so much for asking that question. And if you will indulge me for 1 second, I'd like to...
I'll indulge you as long as the chair will.
Well, hopefully the chair will also indulge me. I'd like to go back to the fraud question, because there's a very important fact that has not been stated, which is the merchant bears the cost of online fraud. So when card is not present, the merchant bears the cost of that fraud. And what has happened through COVID and through natural consumer behaviors is the mix of shopping has moved online. So our costs are also going up from that perspective. And we're talking about the cost that these guys have invested, which I believe they have, in terms of anti-fraud. I just think it's really important to remember we're paying the cost of online fraud. That said, so to answer your question in terms of what I would want, the credit card swipe fee issue is one of the biggest issues that we have that I think that the government has a role in. I don't know today what the government could do related to our inability to source toilet paper. That's actually that's the beginning of the pandemic, so we have plenty of toilet paper now. But credit card fees, as I said before, we operate on a 1% profit margin. Bank fees today are our third largest cost. We actually pay more in bank fees than we make. What we are looking for is fair competition, not asking for huge regulatory things and caps and decreases. Look, if you want to have decreases, I'll take them. But that's not what we're asking for. What we're asking for is to create a level playing field so that there's competition. What Doug said before is exactly right. Competition works. And in this industry, there isn't any. And I do believe that's the role of our government, is to create level and fair playing fields.
I think, I'm going to have a hearing this afternoon that's kind of loosely related to this subject, but I also think it's something that we in our banking, in my capacity in banking committee, we should take a look at that. I believe in hyper competition. I think that it's incredibly important. if there is a basis for anti-competitive behavior, we've got a division in the DOJ to deal with it. But I think a lot of the things that we can do to kind of ease the burden and address these issues, I look forward to taking up in the Banking Committee. Thank you all.
Thanks, Senator Tillis. By virtue of the miracle of Zoom, I think we'll join the senator from Minnesota. Are you on board?
I am on board. So thank you very much, Chair Durbin. And I want to first ask, as you know, Mr. Chair, one of my jobs is the chair of the subcommittee on antitrust. I do a lot in that area. And so I thought I would take a little different approach and ask you about this, Mr. Cantor. Today, a number of our witnesses have testified about a lack of competition in credit and debit card markets, resulting in higher interchange fees that can harm consumers, merchants. Do you think that stronger antitrust enforcement could lead to more competitive credit and debit card markets?
Thank you, Senator. I do think more and better antitrust enforcement would be welcome here. It's needed. This is an area where the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice has been active over time, as has the Federal Trade Commission, but there's a lot more to be done. These litigations go on for a very long time, involve lots of economists, and so there are, as we pointed out, big pieces of the puzzle that are still unresolved, how the fees get set and the rules and restraints that go around protecting those fees from market forces. So absolutely some more enforcement would be welcome.
Very, very good. In your opinion, and you know, you've got an active antitrust divisions, you've got interest in going after cases, but in your opinion, what's the impact of Supreme Court decisions like Ohio v. American Express on competition in credit markets?
So we disagree with the opinion in American Express versus Ohio. We think it will cause problems, not just in this area, but frankly, dealing with other technology platforms, which have been a focus, I know, Senator, of your subcommittee and others in the Congress, and that could be problematic. What's important to note, though, is that even under the standard articulated in American Express versus Ohio, this credit card market is an antitrust problem, and there is plenty of consumer harm in the record of cases that are going on right now to show that, in fact, it's an antitrust problem. That said, as I mentioned earlier, there's an important role for Congress to play here to decide how competition should work going forward so that we have some. These antitrust cases, while very, very important, you know, courts really have a different role in this, and so we want to pay attention to the Congress's role here as well.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it, and this is off this topic, but if you have monopolies, which we have in the tech area, Google has 90% market share. There's just no doubt we have monopolies. That you have to, at the same time, and maybe this is what you're getting at in a very different context, you have to ensure there's rules of the road in place by industry, so that if there's not going to be a change through the courts, in my case with tech, which will take years, you at least have to be able to make sure that they're not preferencing their own products and creating an anti-competitive marketplace. That's what this is about. I have Mr. Kim, I have a question of you.
Sure.
Okay. You've testified that payment systems require constant investment and protection, and that interchange fees cover much of that cost. We can all agree that card transactions have to be safe. There's cybersecurity issues, threats, those things. Can you elaborate on the types of costs that interchange fees help cover from the perspective of mid-size and community card issuers?
Sure. So we have to have 7x24 customer service available to our customers wherever they're transacting, whatever time zone. So when there are problems with transactions, if we're going on networks around the world that are not as reliable, it's important for us to be able to choose our networks because all networks are not created equally. So sometimes we have to resolve problems there. We are constantly looking at data to try to assess fraud. We had a substantial fraud attempt with bots trying to open up accounts, open up credit card accounts, and then in turn extract money from the consumers and then ultimately us. So it's that kind of investment in data, investment in information so that we can collect cell phone numbers and tell people, hey, this transaction went through on your card. Was it really you? And can we do that instantaneously? So those are just some examples of how we invest to make the transaction and payment business work.
Okay, very good. The question kind of along the same line, can you talk about how you see midsize and community card issuers fitting into the payment landscape now and into the future? That's my last question.
Sure. So that's a challenging thing. We spend a lot of time looking at all the financial technology firms that are getting into the business and taking away parts of it from the traditional banking industry, and how can we partner with them effectively or compete against them. And so certainly, as many have said, across maybe apples and oranges, but I think it's all payments, so maybe they're all apples. Lots of competition going on there. And it's hard for us, but we have to be nimble. We have to partner with smart organizations that can help us with networks. My ability to process transactions internationally at all times of the day depend on the networks and depend on the investment in the networks. And that's going to be, we have to have good partners and they have to be able to help us. That's how we'll continue to exist in the payments ecosystem.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Senator Klobuchar. I'll just have a few questions. Mr. Kim, first, let me say that we did a little research when you were added to the panel about Commerce Bank. I'm familiar with it, of course, living in the region. And I want to thank you for continuing to offer free checking even through the onslaught of the Durbin Amendment. You continued to offer free checking. It's just, it's noteworthy, and I want to make sure it was part of the record. And on your profitability, your bank's doing pretty well. Would you agree?
Yes.
And you're not exempt from the Durbin Amendment because your valuation is over $10 billion.
That's correct. And we are doing well, but we're resourceful and we're nimble and we figure out how to do things. And I would say we did discontinue free checking for a period of time, and we reintroduced it recently in the last year.
Glad you did that.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk about your profit margins, I won't repeat what we're reading here. I will say, Ms. Carrot, what you're dealing with, 1.5%, is about as thin as it gets in terms of vulnerability. The one thing that you said earlier that stuck with me, among other things, was that the change in fee came in a stack of papers 300 pages long.
It was a very large deck.
Do you have to hire a lawyer, or did anyone go through this with you?
So we're lucky enough that we have a good team of accountants and lawyers to go through that. But it's a very complicated thing to understand, and I think purposely so, to understand what the fees are and how they're changing.
And Mr. Cantor, Ms. Carrot has said she has the staff, professional staff, to do this. You're representing convenience stores. Some of them are large chains, but some are not. So how do they cope with the 300-page fee change?
They can't. 60% of them are single store operators, and they don't even get the hundreds of pages, frankly. They don't get any of this. They just take the increases, and it is very difficult for their businesses. One quick thing I'd note, too, with respect to this free checking question, I want to clear up, because a couple of the questions today dealt with this GAO report. GAO got a couple of studies handed to it, at least one of which, I think maybe both of which were cited by Mr. Kim. But what those studies did was they looked at the decline of free checking starting in January of 2009. The Durbin Amendment didn't go into effect until October of 2011. So there's actually almost 3 years of decline in free checking while this was going on, and I cite many articles. I frankly ran out of the energy to continue citing them, but this was during the time of the financial crisis. And yes, free checking was going away before the Durbin Amendment ever happened. And Mr. Kim properly cited the study for noting that free checking even continued to go away after passage of the Durbin Amendment, but it was over a year before any of that took effect. And the study notes that, well, we're not going to look at other changes in Dodd-Frank because, they didn't take effect for more than a year after passage. All of this is just a sideshow, frankly, one, to distract from anti-competitive activity in credit cards, but two, to try to discredit the reforms that occurred. Losing free checking because of the financial crisis and the difficulties banks were in at the time is not the same as a reform that came into effect years later and that the ABA numbers you cited showed actually went up when you look at the right time period. So free checking has its own competitive market dynamics that mostly has to do with interest rate environment and how banks are competing and want to compete to get more money in from depositors and the value they place on that. So it's an unrelated thing there.
Thank you very much.
Senator, could I add something on that GAO report? That the banks are relying heavily on this GAO report that claims the Durbin Amendment has caused the downfall of everything. It's not a study. It's largely based on a survey of a few stakeholders that the GAO interviewed. And some stakeholders said, what's the worst thing you've seen? Was it the Credit Card Act? Or was it the Durbin Amendment? Or was it the creation of the CFPB? And they simply, a small number of stakeholders said the Durbin Amendment was bad. I am unimpressed with the GAO study, the most recent one.
I have been edged out by COVID-19 as one of the worst things that we've ever faced. At least for now, but who knows? It could get worse going forward. My bottom line is simple. It goes back to 16 years ago when I walked in this room and saw that stack of papers and had one of the customers of Visa and Mastercard say, we can't even get the complete contract. They give us this summary of it, and we couldn't read it if we received it. It is so complex, it lacks any effort toward transparency or simplicity. And secondly, there is no competition. They announced the fee changes, both companies, the same day. They're coming at you, Ms. Carrot. There is a dual-engined force in this situation. I don't think that's healthy. I think if you believe in the market economy, competition is part of it, isn't it? Shouldn't it be? I think that's what most MBAs conclude, maybe even liberals. So I would say that this conversation will continue. We're going to have a hearing on this subject at least every 16 years. I think the American people need to know the story about these fees that cost merchants and customers and why they're not disclosed. There's a reason. I think there'd be a revolt even more strongly against them. We're facing inflation, and the last thing the American people need is a higher swipe fee. I wish both companies had resisted the urge to make some money when they can. The hearing record will remain open for a week. I have some letters and statements, whether they're for me or against for or against the Durbin Amendment, all will be included in the record. At this point, the hearing stands adjourned. Thank you.